Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 523, Reunification, Part 3. We've covered a lot of famous names so far on the revised introduction to Japanese history, from poets to statesmen to religious leaders and everything in between. And yet, when we think of the great names of Japanese history, so to speak, I think it's fairly clear that Tokugawa Ieyasu stands above them all. He is, simply put, possibly the most famous person in Japanese history, and while such things are hard to quantify, I think it's clear his impact on the course of Japan's history was massive. We have, of course, already covered Ieyasu's origins. Originally named Matsudaira Motoyasu, he was the heir of a minor family from Mikawa province, and spent his youth as a political hostage, first to the Oda, and then to their more powerful neighbors, the Imagawa. After Oda Nobunaga crushed the Imagawa once and for all at the Battle of Okehazama in 1560, Ieyasu wisely hitched his wagon to Nobunaga's rising star and eventually found himself among the inner circle of Nobunaga's most prominent generals. It was after that period that he changed his name as well. After Nobunaga's death, Ieyasu made a brief attempt to take control of the Oda clan, by which, of course, I mean he attempted to show his profound loyalty to his master's memory by elevating one of his sons, Oda Nobukatsu, to leadership. In the process, Ieyasu briefly came to blows with Hideyoshi and is actually one of very few commanders to defeat the Taiko's forces on the field of battle in 1584 at the battles of Komaki and Nagakute. Eventually, however, Ieyasu realized he could not prevail against the sheer numbers and resources which Hideyoshi could bring to bear, and abandoned his campaign in favor of accepting Hideyoshi's preferred candidate, the infant Hidenobu. As Toyotomi Hideyoshi accrued more and more power to himself, Ieyasu was once again loyal to his new master, and quickly he became a part of the inner circle once again. Hideyoshi would reward this newfound loyalty, but as far as we can tell, never fully trusted Ieyasu. For example, 2 years after reunification, Hideyoshi would offer Ieyasu a deal. Give up the 5 provinces along the Pacific coast he'd accrued over the course of his career in exchange for 8. Which on its face is quite a bargain, but those 8 provinces were further from the center of the country, in the Kanto Plains, which had once upon a time been home to the Kamakura Bakufu. The area was also full of samurai left over from the former rulers of the area whom Hideyoshi had deposed, and whose loyalty to a newly installed Ieyasu would be questionable at best. Ieyasu, however, took the bargain and spent the next few years building a power base for himself in the east, centered on an administrative headquarters built in a sleepy little fishing village called Edo. Now, one of the great questions of Tokugawa Ieyasu's life is the nature of his ambition. Did he always intend to seize power for himself in the long term, hoping to outlive Hideyoshi, 4 years his senior, and take advantage of the instability of succession to do so? Or was he simply an opportunist who saw an opening after Hideyoshi's death and seized it? We don't really have anything from the man himself on the subject, of course, and so can only speculate. That said, I do think it is clear that some of Hideyoshi's decisions after his success at reunifying Japan in 1590 would leave an ambitious man like Ieyasu a pretty big opening. The issue of succession, as we talked about at the end of last week, was of course a pretty big one. We've had our share of succession crises at this point in Japanese history, so the key issue is not new to us. In a political system where loyalty to the state was also wrapped up in loyalty to, or at least fear of, an individual, the replacement of that individual with another always meant a period of some uncertainty. And Hideyoshi, to put things lightly, didn't really set his heir up for success. He had difficulty conceiving what kids he did have tended to die in childbirth, at least until 1592, when one of his concubines gave birth to a child, Toyotomi Hideyori. That concubine is known as Yodo Dono, and she has a fascinating life all her own. She was the eldest of 3 daughters born to Oichi and Azai Nagamasa, the sister of Oda Nobunaga, and one of many people who got in Nobunaga's way and paid the price for it. For his defiance, Azai Nagamasa was killed, Oichi herself was spared but remarried one of Hideyoshi's enemies and killed herself during his downfall. Nagamasa's sons met a similar fate, but his 3 daughters were spared and took up residence with the Oda. Yodo Dono would end up in the household of Hideyoshi. Her younger sisters would end up in similarly influential positions. The second, Ohatsu, would marry Kyogoku Takatsugu, who was a follower first of Nobunaga, then Hideyoshi, and then Ieyasu. The third, Oeo, would end up after a few failed marriages with Tokugawa Hidetada, Ieyasu's son and heir. Anyway, the son born to Yodo Dono and Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1592 is known as Toyotomi Hideyori, and his birth pretty much upended the whole succession discussion. Previously, Hideyoshi had favored his nephew Hidetsugu to take over for him, but after Hideyori's birth, Hidetsugu would end up in increasing disfavor and ultimately would be killed in 1595. The traditional interpretation of Hidetsugu's execution at Hideyoshi's order is that the Taiko wished to avoid any sort of ambiguity over who would take over, that he killed Hidetsugu to remove a potential challenge to his new preferred heir. The records we do have from those close to Hideyoshi, though again none from the man himself, complicate the picture somewhat, suggesting that at first Hideyoshi decided he would divide control between his nephew and son after his death, or set Hidetsugu up as regent, because Hidetsugu was 24 when Hideyori was born. A growing concern over a succession dispute mingled with concerns about Hidetsugu's character. Hidetsugu was apparently given to a vicious, cruel streak. One account by the Jesuit Louis Froy, who presumably had no dog in this fight, describes him as practicing with a musket by having his personal guards grab random travelers to serve as a target. Obviously, Hideyoshi himself had no issue with cruelty, but there is a difference between a willingness to use violence and a preference for violence, and Hidetsugu may well have been on the wrong end of the scale. Regardless of why precisely Hideyoshi made the call, Hidetsugu's death did create an issue for the Taiko. He still had his son, but that son was very young, and by the 1590s Hideyoshi was getting up in years, 55 when his son was born, and 55 hard and stressful years at that. If Hideyoshi could hang on until Hideyori was older, that'd be one thing. But in the end, he couldn't, as Hideyoshi, spoilers, would live only 6 more years after having his heir. The other issue that destabilized Toyotomi rule during the 1590s was Hideyoshi's controversial choice to launch a full-scale invasion of Korea. Now, even while unification was still going on in the 1580s, Hideyoshi himself made references to plans for continental expansion. In a letter to his primary wife, Nenehime, in 1587, he wrote that, quote, "By fast ships I have dispatched orders to Korea to serve the throne of Japan. Should Korea fail to serve, I will punish that country. Even China will enter my grip, I will command it during my lifetime." He said the same to one of his own vassals in 1586, Mori Terumoto, of the same Mori clan from a few episodes back, quote, "I will command China in my lifetime." And in that same year, the Jesuit Louis Froy recounted a conversation with the Taiko, quote, "He also said that he had reached the point of subjugating all Japan, whence his mind was not set upon the future acquisitions of more kingdoms or more wealth in it, since he had enough, but solely upon immortalizing himself with the name and fame of his power. In order to do so, he was resolved to reduce the affairs of Japan to order, to place them on a stable basis, and this done to entrust them to his brother Hidanaga, while he himself should pass to the conquest of Korea and China. If he met his death in that undertaking, he did not mind, inasmuch as it would be said he was the first lord of Japan who had ventured on such an enterprise. Clearly, Hideyoshi's own ego was a big part of this decision. His desire to be immortalized as one of the greatest figures in Japanese history led him to attempt something no other figure in Japanese history had, at least not since the Age of Myth. According to the Kojiki, the mythic emperor Chuai and his empress Jingu had invaded Korea back in the 200s CE, but there's no substantial documentation of that. However, was the invasion just a matter of ego? There are a few other theories that tend to get bandied about to explain Hideyoshi's decision. The most common is that after reunification, Hideyoshi faced the same dilemma every other warrior-class ruler we've discussed has: how to maintain supremacy without the ability to secure loyalty by distributing loot from victories. One of the main ways Hideyoshi had been able to secure his power was, of course, by bribing his followers with land and treasure from the defeated, but now that was no longer possible, at least not without starting a new war. A related reason that's often suggested is the need to occupy, for lack of a better word, the samurai class. Hideyoshi had, over the course of his rise, built a sort of military coalition with himself on top, supported by his Fudai, his trusted retainers and followers, and then the Tozama, the wide range of daimyo whose loyalty to him was doubtful, but who accepted the Taiko's rule because of his military might. The problem with that balance, though, was that over time it would naturally shift. His enemies would rebuild their armies and finances, and who was to say the balance wouldn't eventually tip their way? A new war was a new project, for lack of a better word, to keep them occupied, to drain the wealth and manpower of the samurai class, so said wealth and power could not be turned on him. Which is a pretty messed up way to think about invading another country, but there you have it. Then, of course, there's the question of madness. One could definitely characterize Hideyoshi's behavior in the 1590s as erratic. The Korean invasion, the sudden about-face on Hidetsugu, and a few other things besides, like a crackdown on Christians in 1596, and the execution of one of his most prominent advisors, the tea master Sen no Rikyu, in 1591. And this, combined with some increasingly outlandish public statements, in a letter to the king of the Ryukyus, Hideyoshi described being blessed by Amaterasu herself during the moment of his birth, have led some to suggest that Hideyoshi's very success had driven him over the proverbial top and led him to be consumed by his own ego, and that he had descended into a violent madness against any and all he saw as a threat. And of course that's not impossible, but it is worth noting there are other ways to explain what might superficially seem to be a descent into madness. There are, as we've seen, other explanations for the Korean campaign beyond a descent into insanity, brutal, ruthless ones that any moral person would reject as a reason for war, but frankly, if you are a moral person, I don't think you make it to the kind of position a guy like Hideyoshi held. Similarly, there were rational, if brutal, reasons of state for killing Hidetsugu. The Christian crackdown can similarly be explained in terms of a growing concern regarding the threat of the church to Hideyoshi's careful balance of power. After all, the church demanded loyalty from its followers, loyalty which would naturally conflict with Hideyoshi's desire for political power and control. And to be entirely frank here, it wasn't like the church was innocent. Hideyoshi had issued an edict banning Catholic missionaries from Japan in 1587, but hadn't really attempted to enforce it, clearly an attempt in retrospect to rein in the growth of the church without alienating it or Japan's Christians completely. Hideyoshi wanted continued trade with the Portuguese and later the Spanish, who found their own way into Asia, but was concerned at the possibility of the church undermining his authority or serving as a fifth column, supporting Portuguese or Spanish imperial expansion into Japan. Indeed, the inciting incident for the Christian crackdown of 1596 was a dispute over a Spanish shipwreck in the domain of one of Hideyoshi's followers, the daimyo of Tosa, Chosokabe Motochika. When Hideyoshi's bureaucrats were adjudicating what was in essence a salvage dispute over the shipwreck between the Spanish and Tosa domain, the Spanish ship captain essentially bragged about the reach and power of the Spanish Empire, and intimated the church was itself a wing of the empire. Its followers could be directed against the Japanese government in the name of Spanish conquest. Clearly, the hope here was to intimidate Hideyoshi, but instead he got himself and several other Christians executed, because you're not going to scare a guy like Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Sen no Rikyu's fate has a similar explanation. He wasn't just a tea master, but one of Hideyoshi's advisors, and may have gotten caught up in some political divisions between rival camps in Hideyoshi's government, and been using his influence to enrich himself. Obviously, there's more to these stories than we can get into here, but the upshot is that it's not quite straightforward to say Hideyoshi was a few karuta short of a full deck. The reality is a bit more complex. Hideyoshi, at the head of a coalition government he had built as he'd gone along, and with not much to legitimate his rule beyond military power and an alliance with the imperial court, may have simply gambled that relying on violence, which after all had gotten him this far, would hurt his dynastic ambitions less than being too timid. If that was the idea, though, it didn't work. Hideyoshi would take ill in 1598 and die before the end of the year at the age of 61. He left behind a wasteful and deeply unpopular war in Korea, which did succeed in draining the treasuries and manpower of the daimyo, but mostly of the daimyo who most supported the Toyotomi, and which was promptly and quietly abandoned by his successors without any real gains. He left behind an heir who was, by this point, 6, and he left behind a reputation for violence which alienated many. For example, the daimyo Mogami Yoshiaki, previously a loyal supporter of the Toyotomi, lost a daughter who was married to Toyotomi Hidetsugu when the former heir was purged, and never forgave Hideyoshi for not sparing her. So all of that explains why the position of the Toyotomi house was weak when the Taiko died in 1598, but why was Tokugawa Ieyasu the one to seize power? At least in part, the answer is that Ieyasu enjoyed Hideyoshi's trust, or at least some trust. As the Taiko lay dying, he knew that his 6-year-old heir was not in position to take over, and thus decided to set up a council of 5 elders to serve as regents for him. Ieyasu was one of these regents. The others were the daimyo Ukita Hideye, Maeda Toshiie, Mori Terumoto, and Uesugi Kagekatsu. The theory was that each of these daimyo were loyal to Hideyoshi, or at least had shown a willingness to go along with him from fairly early on, and distrusted all of the others. Thus they could hopefully balance each other out, and if any one of them tried to seize power after Hideyoshi's death, the others would combine to stop him. Together they were to manage Hideyori's education, as the boy grew up inside the walls of Hideyoshi's main fortress at Osaka, the port city along the inland sea at the mouth of the waterways which led to Kyoto itself, built atop the ruins of the old Ishiyama Honganji. The regents were also to manage the affairs of the country by consensus in Hideyoshi's name until Hideyori reached his majority. At least, that was the theory. In practice, things broke down pretty quickly. The immediate inciting incident was the death in 1599 of one of the regents, Maeda Toshiie. Toshiie had been a longtime follower of Oda Nobunaga and was one of the very first to jump ship to Hideyoshi, one of the lead commanders, in fact, at Hideyoshi's glorious victory at Shizugatake, which we talked about last week. As a result, he had been handsomely rewarded and was both personally very loyal to the Toyotomi and one of the most powerful daimyo in Japan. His heir Maeda Toshinaga was less directly attached to the Toyotomi cause and friendly to Ieyasu, who was already the most influential member of the regents. The relocation to the Kanto, which had been intended to both reward Ieyasu and put the ambitious man a little bit physically further from Kyoto, had worked out pretty well for him. Ieyasu had managed to secure control of lands which were now worth 2.4 million koku of rice, according to the land surveys compiled by Hideyoshi, making him by far the most wealthy of the 5 regents. His position in the Kanto Plains also enabled him to build strong relationships with many of the smaller clans of eastern Japan. By comparison, the next wealthiest regent was Uesugi Kagekatsu, with 1.2 million koku of land, and the poorest was Ukita Hideye, with a mere 570,000. All of which is to say that Ieyasu's strong starting position among the regents combined with the flipping, so to speak, of the Maeda, who were among the poorer regents with a measly 830,000 koku to their names, led the careful balance Hideyoshi had crafted to collapse within just over a year after his death. Still, Ieyasu's advantage was not decisive, chiefly because while he had a strong power base in the east, much of the west of the country was controlled by his enemies. In addition, Uesugi Kagekatsu, again the second wealthiest of the regents, was situated in what's now Niigata to the north of Ieyasu's heartland in the Kanto, which presented a huge tactical issue because it meant that Ieyasu had enemies both to the north and to the west, and were they to coordinate in an attack, he would have to split his forces to deal with them, leaving him very vulnerable to being overwhelmed on one side or the other, or both. The breaking point finally came in the summer of 1600, beginning with news reaching Ieyasu in Osaka, where the regents met to manage the affairs of the realm, that Uesugi Kagekatsu had begun a military buildup in his territory. Ieyasu, perceiving this, not unjustifiably, as a threat to himself, sent a letter to Kagekatsu declaring the buildup a violation of the laws left in place by Hideyoshi, which it was, and demanding that the regent come to Kyoto to explain himself. Kagekatsu responded by denying the charge and accusing Ieyasu of his own violations of Hideyoshi's decrees, for example by arranging marriages with other powerful clans without permission from the regents, because such marriages could be the basis of an alliance aimed at seizing power, and yes, Ieyasu did break those rules. Neither side was going to back down, and Ieyasu and Uesugi Kagekatsu both mobilized their forces and prepared for a fight. At this moment, another of Ieyasu's enemies, a senior Toyotomi retainer named Ishida Mitsunari, decided to organize his own anti-Tokugawa army in western Japan and march east to join Kagekatsu and crush Ieyasu. The resulting summer campaign of 1600 is probably one of the most studied military campaigns in Japanese history, because the results would be very decisive for the Tokugawa side. Ieyasu at the start of the campaign was hemmed in by enemies to the north in the Uesugi and by the advancing western army of Ishida Mitsunari, but he had a few cards to play of his own. Remember a few episodes back, I talked about the rise of the Date clan in northern Japan, one of the families to emerge from obscurity during the civil wars under the leadership of Date Masamune? Well, Masamune's brash and aggressive style had led him to repeatedly defy orders from Toyotomi Hideyoshi to submit, and it was only the personal intervention of none other than Tokugawa Ieyasu which kept him in power and his head attached to his shoulders. Masamune was, as a result, well disposed to Ieyasu, and joined his forces when the summer campaign kicked off, and with the help of Ieyasu's son and heir Tokugawa Hidetada, he was able to keep the Uesugi from making much headway against Ieyasu's forces. Meanwhile, Ieyasu took the bulk of his forces west to deal with Ishida Mitsunari. The two armies met on October 21st at Sekigahara, in what's now Gifu Prefecture, more or less in the center of Honshu, and in the end, Ieyasu prevailed. Crucial to his victory were two defections from Ishida's side. First, while the Mori clan of Mori Terumoto arranged themselves against Ieyasu, one of the close advisors to the clan leadership, Kikkawa Hiroie, decided that Ieyasu looked like he was going to win, and so cut a separate deal with the Tokugawa. On the day of the battle, Kikkawa, one of the vanguard commanders of the Mori contingent, delayed joining the fighting while positioning his own forces so as to block some of the rearguard elements of the Western Army from coming up to the battlefield. More dramatic was the betrayal of Kobayakawa Hideaki, one of the commanders of the Western side and son of Hideyoshi's brother-in-law. Perhaps because of this family relationship, Kobayakawa had been given a high-ranking position in command of the latter part of Hideyoshi's Korean War. By all accounts, he was not a great commander and in particular was routinely criticized for his handling of the war by another high-placed member of the Toyotomi leadership, Ishida Mitsunari. As you might imagine, Kobayakawa had little love for Ishida because of this, and was open to being persuaded that, all things considered, he might be better off turning on Ishida and the Western Army. Come the day, Kobayakawa hesitated for a time, but ultimately after the first few hours of fighting, he decided to follow through and cast his lot in with Ieyasu, which was disastrous for the Western Army because Kobayakawa's forces were tasked with controlling a high ground flank of the Western force. Once he betrayed them, his forces could fire down onto the Western Army from the side, while Ieyasu's attacked from the front. Hit from two sides, the Western Army disintegrated. Ishida himself fled the field, but was captured by peasants in a nearby village and turned over to Ieyasu for a reward. Not really the sentimental type, Ieyasu had him beheaded and the severed head put on public display. The Battle of Sekigahara was, in retrospect, the climactic moment for Tokugawa Ieyasu's political career. He did not roundly defeat all political rivals. Several powerful clans aligned against him, such as the Mori of western Honshu or the Shimazu of southern Kyushu, were able to escape with their forces relatively intact. However, in the aftermath of the Western Army's defeat, Ieyasu's backers now had a strong military advantage. He would spend the next few years solidifying his new base of power by taking advantage of his military supremacy. And again, it's important to note here that Tokugawa supremacy was not complete. Victory at Sekigahara didn't guarantee Ieyasu complete dominion over the country. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at one hypothetical example in the form of our old friends in the Mori clan. The Mori, by this point headed by Mori Terumoto, grandson of the great Mori Motonari, were quite prominent on the western side of the conflict. The clan's own forces were also largely intact thanks to the interference of Kikkawa Hiroie, and so Terumoto was able to make it back from Sekigahara to his castle town of Hiroshima in western Honshu. Ieyasu did not particularly like or trust Terumoto, naturally enough, but had a challenging choice to make in terms of dealing with him. Certainly he had a numerical advantage that could have been pressed with an invasion of Terumoto's territories in western Honshu to remove the Mori from power once and for all. But that would be a massive undertaking. Hideyoshi had left the Mori, who had come over to his side peacefully and early, with 5 whole provinces in a part of Japan that was remote from Ieyasu's home base. An invasion would be expensive in both manpower and money, and of course the thing with war is that there are no guarantees. Something can always go wrong, and even with an advantage, there's no certainty of the outcome. And remember, while Mori Terumoto was among the more prominent remaining anti-Tokugawa voices, he was not the only one, or even necessarily the one who would be the hardest to deal with. There were many such clans scattered throughout the country, particularly in western Japan, and some in even more remote parts of the country that would be even harder to strike militarily. For example, the Shimazu clan, led by Shimazu Yoshihiro, was based in the remote south of Kyushu with 2 remote provinces to his name. So while Ieyasu could have rolled the dice on continued military efforts against his defeated foes to eliminate them outright, he judged discretion to be the better part of valor. He had won, and rather than betting his chips again on the chance of winning bigger, it was time to cash out. So Ieyasu began to strike deals with his defeated foes. He would let them live, often in reduced conditions, in exchange for their loyalty. Mori Terumoto, for example, had to give up 3 of his 5 provinces, including his fortress city of Hiroshima, which was handed over to a Tokugawa loyalist. Shimazu Yoshihiro, being a bit more remote, and thus in a stronger negotiating position, was able to keep both of his provinces. By 1603, Ieyasu felt secure enough to take the final step. He petitioned Emperor Goyose to revive the old post of shogun, which had lain vacant since Ashikaga Yoshiaki had been given the boot in 1573, and to grant it to him. Ieyasu would hold the post for only a few years before abdicating in favor of his son, but continued to exercise behind-the-scenes authority until his death. His descendants would hold the post of shogun for the next 2.5 centuries. There was, of course, one final coda to be written in the story of Ieyasu's rise to power. Just as Toyotomi Hideyoshi had risen to power initially while proclaiming his continued loyalty to the memory of Oda Nobunaga, Tokugawa Ieyasu had maintained during his rise that he was loyal to the memory of Hideyoshi. He was fighting, he said, to remove bad influences from the young and impressionable Hideyori. But having taken the chance to become shogun, it was hard to argue he had any interest in handing power over to the infant Toyotomi Hideyori, who was 8 years old at the time of Sekigahara. It also wasn't like Ieyasu could have just had Hideyori and his mother Yododono killed. Doing so would have invited discord in the Tokugawa camp among those with lingering pro-Toyotomi sentiments at a time when Ieyasu still needed stability to secure his hold on power. So, what's to be done with the boy? The initial plan seems to have been to leave Hideyori alone and just hope that, much as the children of Nobunaga had accommodated themselves to Hideyoshi's rise to power, or at least either chosen to do that or died, Hideyori would grow up to accept that Ieyasu was now calling the shots. Ieyasu left the boy and his mother Yododono in Osaka Castle and allowed them some generous fiefs to maintain themselves, though until Hideyori reached adulthood, Ieyasu would hold the land in trust. The hope was probably that Hideyori would grow up to be just another daimyo swearing his fealty to Ieyasu as shogun, much as Oda Hidenobu had actually grown up to be a follower of Hideyoshi's. Ieyasu tried a few other means of securing Hideyori's fealty in the long term. For example, the same year he became shogun, he also pressured Hideyori's mother, Yododono, to accept an arranged marriage between Hideyori and Senhime, Ieyasu's granddaughter by way of his eldest son Hidetada, and Hidetada's wife, Oeo. As a reminder, Oeo, also known as Sugenin, was Yododono's sister, the youngest of Oichi's 3 surviving daughters by Azai Nagamasa, which did, yes, make Senhime and Hideyori cousins, but hey, that's aristocracy, baby. In 1611, Ieyasu would once again make a demand of Yododono. Ieyasu, now retired as shogun in favor of Tokugawa Hidetada, but largely still calling the shots, was going to be in town, or at least nearby in Kyoto, for the enthronement of the new emperor, Emperor Go-Mizuno, number 108 in the traditional ordering, and he asked that Hideyori visit him at Nijo Castle in Kyoto while he was in town. Yododono was forced to agree, though she did secure some hostages from the Tokugawa family as protection. And this meeting is often described as the moment when Ieyasu realized Hideyori was no longer a kid. At 17 now, he was young and astute and a potential challenger. At least that's the story, though once again it's hard to find much in the way of contemporary discussion backing up that interpretation. However, we do have plenty of letters between Yododono and her sisters, married to a pro-Tokugawa daimyo and to the new shogun, respectively. Those 2 sisters tried to convince their eldest sibling to accept the new order of things, but Yododono remained fiercely opposed. Instead, she raised her young son with the notion that he should strive to reclaim his father's birthright. And so, once again, a decisive break came in 1614, when tensions were flaring high over a bell of all damn things. Specifically, Hideyori had been investing in repairs to both Osaka Castle itself, which needed some fixes after a few years of neglect, and to Hokoji, a temple in Kyoto, a project funded by Hideyoshi in his own memory. Ieyasu was deeply alarmed by the rebuilding of Osaka Castle's defenses, and so seized on a seemingly minor complaint to force the issue once and for all. The problem, Ieyasu claimed, was one of the bells Hideyori had commissioned for Hokoji. Specifically, the bell contained the phrase Kokka Anko inscribed on it, something like, "the nation at peace." However, the phrase also contained the characters for the name Ieyasu, but divided up by an intervening character, which Ieyasu suggested meant that Hideyori was trying to imply that the only way to achieve a nation at peace was to chop Ieyasu up. This was obviously a bit of a reach, but Ieyasu had come to accept there would be no conciliation and that Hideyori would never come around to the new way of things, and so had to be removed. On Hideyori's side, a group of his counselors tried to convince the boy, by this point in his 20s, not to pick a fight with Ieyasu, but the hardliners backed by Yododono won out. The result in 1615 was one final battle, as Ieyasu mobilized his forces and marched on Hideyori's fortress at Osaka Castle, while Hideyori put out the call to anyone with a bone to pick with Ieyasu, "Join me and make a stand against the new order." And quite a few people did take him up on that, but not enough. The siege was hard fought over the course of months, but in the end, Ieyasu won. Hideyori and Yododono committed suicide together. The only survivors of Osaka Castle were Senhime herself, whose release was negotiated before the final battle, and the couple's only child, a young daughter who grew up to be a Buddhist nun. Ieyasu's victory was complete, and there would be no more challengers. He would die the next year at the age of 73, the ultimate victor of the age of reunification. Next week, we'll look at the new order Ieyasu and his successors constructed. For now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to the patrons who have given at our shoutout tier: Yan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Special thanks also to new donors to the History of Japan Patreon, Roger, Cameron, and Tilly, for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time for the structure of the Tokugawa state.